Color theory can be tricky. There's a reason that if you go to design school, you'll spend months covering the topic. The goal of this lesson is not to give you some 360-degree view of color theory and all of its many nuances. Instead, we're going to go beyond the visuals and teach you how to build a robust color system that will help you succeed in your daily role as a product designer. Let's dive in. Our starting point today is going to be HSB. I think as product designers, it helps so much to be using HSB instead of hex codes because it creates a more systematic process that we can use to make sure that our brand palette is cohesive, and that also the neutrals palette that we're using, so all of the grays that we're using to support our brand palette, work really well with those primary colors. If you're not familiar, a quick crash course on HSB. These three numbers represent the hue for H, S for saturation, and the brightness. The saturation and brightness are on a 0 to 100 scale, and essentially you can think of the brightness as more of black and the saturation as more of white. If I would take this down to 0, it's going to make the color white no matter what my hue is. And conversely, if I take the brightness down to 0, it's going to make the color black no matter what the hue is. Now, there are a couple general rules that really help me take advantage of HSB. And the first one relates to the primary palette, and that's what we're going to cover now. And when I say primary palette, all I'm talking about is your primary color, your secondary color, and maybe you have a series of accent colors. So when we're dealing with primary colors, we want to make sure that the saturation and the brightness is relatively standardized across the colors in that primary palette. And when I say standardized, they don't have to be the exact same number. Remember, eyeball test is almost always as important as the numbers themselves. So you want to make sure that it is visually pleasing. But the perfect starting point is making sure that these saturation numbers are all within 10 points of each other, and that the brightness is all within 10 points of each other. So you can see these are the three main colors that I use for the Figma Academy brand. And all of the brightnesses are within 10 points, and the same thing for the saturation. And I know that no matter what hues I'm working with, they're more or less going to create a cohesive palette if I keep these numbers the same. And just to illustrate that point, if I change this hue number, which is just this slider up here, I can make it almost kind of anything. Maybe it's like a pink. Maybe it's this teal color. And obviously there's some massaging that has to happen. But if I know that these numbers are the same, and I could actually make them the same as my primary color here, you're never going to have something that looks totally off if you keep these last two numbers the same. Okay, now that we have that, let's create a color palette from scratch, and you can kind of see a little bit of the process that I would use. So to do that, we're going to need some kind of a starting point. And I think the importance of this exercise is one, to kind of demonstrate the practice of it, but also to show that color is iterative. You don't have to nail it the first time. It's going to change, and you're always going to be tweaking these different values, trying out different shades and whatnot. So we just want to find a good starting point, knowing that it's inevitably going to change. And what I've done is I have listed out some different websites here that I like to use as my starting points. And I've actually looked at this page by My Mind here, and they have a bunch of different palettes. And so I picked one that I liked. It kind of reminded me of the Figma colors, and I'm going to use that here. And so I've listed out the saturation values and the brightness values. And you can see that the reason this color palette looks good, these two colors work together, is the saturation and the brightness, they both fall into that range of 10 points. And so that right away we know, okay, this passes the test. Now, let's say I want to expand this palette a little bit, and all of a sudden I realize, wow, I really need an accent color. How do you make sure that it's going to look good? One of the things that I really like to do is I will use this tool here by Adobe. And all this is really doing is giving you a UI to explore using those same confines of hue, saturation, and brightness. So I'm going to take the hex code of this yellow and I'm going to put it into the base color here. And you can see we have some options here. I like to go with complementary if I'm looking for more of these like supporting accent colors. And so you can see here, when I click on complementary, it's going to give me these blues, both of which I like. So I'm going to go ahead and take this, I'm going to put it here. And let's look at the HSB. So we have 219, 73, 95. So what do we notice? 73, it matches this yellow exactly. And so the actual science behind the algorithm that Adobe is using is they are standardizing the saturation and the brightness values in order to suggest colors that work well with this yellow. And so really all that did was give us a nice generated output based off of the rule that we were applying in the last lesson. I don't have a great eye for color. I'm not an artist. I like things that are a little bit more systematic. And so this works really, really well because you can simply look at two numbers and know, is this something that is going to create a cohesive palette? And when in doubt, you can use this Adobe color tool. And that process that I just walked you through right there is what I use for every single one of the color palettes that I create. Now, we have our primary palette, these default colors here. The next step is to build out these supporting shades that we can use in little ways throughout our UI design and make a whole lot of difference. At the very minimum, what I find myself doing on pretty much every single project is I will create a light variation and a dark variation for each one of my colors associated with the brand palette. For some use cases, we might need more shades than that, but honestly, I typically find that's a little bit overkill, and most of the time I really only need these shades here. So the way that we create these is also going to follow a little bit of a predictable model. It does involve some tweaking, and as you're using it in your designs, you might realize that you want something a little bit brighter or a little bit darker, but the starting point is almost always the same for me. In order to create the light version of this design, I would start with the default, detach it, and then I'm going to crank the brightness up to 99 and decrease the saturation somewhere in this range of 5 to 10 typically. You can see you barely want to be able to see this thing, and I might land somewhere in the 8 range, and you can see that is what I actually did here. And I'm going to do that across the board for each one of my colors. Something like a yellow is by nature a little bit more of a faint color than the red and the blue. So you can see my saturation for the yellow is 8, but the red and the blue, I bring it down to 6. And then for the dark, I'm going to do the same thing here. So I would start with the primary default, detach it, and then all I do is bump this brightness down to about 50. And I might tweak that a little bit as I'm using it in my designs and realize that I want things to just be a little bit different. But honestly, almost every time this works great. And you can see I just did that across the board where I kept the hue and the saturation the same. I just decreased the brightness down to 50 and you get this nice cohesive dark palette that you can use throughout your designs. And just like that, we have our shades. The last step in setting up our color system is going to be creating a cohesive neutrals palette to support our brand palette. And if you think about the use case and how we're actually using color in our designs, 90+% of our designs are going to be relying on grays rather than actual brand colors. And so it's really important that we create a system that works well. Now, people have different opinions about the number of grays to use, and there is this general idea that we should be standardizing our grays and using less if possible. I think that a nice middle ground is to create a scale from 100 to 900. Using a scale like this works well because it's really easy to talk about with your engineers, and also it will take care of every single use case, I promise. The way that we're going to create this neutrals palette also follows a very predictable model. To start, you'll see that every single one of these colors uses the same hue, and that's 41. And we got that hue from our brand palette. I actually took the number from our primary color and then used that to inform each one of these colors. And that way you know that our neutrals palette is going to be cohesive with the brand palette. And you can kind of see at a glance here, this looks very warm, and that is going to look really nice with our yellows and our reds here. Whereas maybe if we were designing around the color purple, this would look much more cool. So now that we have our hue solidified, now the goal is going to be to start at the edges here with 900 and 100 and actually work towards the center from the bookends. And the way that we're going to do that is by starting off by creating a little bit of a saturation format. And I do it the same way every time. I'm going to be a little bit more saturated towards the darker colors and a little bit less saturated towards the lighter colors. And so you can see for 100, my saturation is 1, and for 900, my saturation is 10. And then from there, I'm simply filling in the gaps. You can see we move from 10, 8, 5, 4, 4, 3, 3, 3, 1. And is it really going to make or break your hex code if the saturation is 5 versus 4? No, of course not. This is simply a high-level model that I like to use that takes the guesswork out of color theory. So from there, the way that I think about it is I want to design around some very specific use cases to make sure that I nail those first. The first one is I want a AAA heading. And that's going to be the easiest one. If I use that same hue, set the saturation to 10 and the brightness to somewhere around 10, it's going to work every single time. From there, I know that I want a AA contrast subtext, because this combination right here between my paragraph text and this heading text is going to be one that I use a lot in my design. I like that subtle contrast difference between my headings and the supporting paragraphs. And so in order for this to be high enough contrast, I need it to be AA, which is a 4.5. And I use the contrast app to measure that. And so you can see if I select this, this passes because it has a contrast ratio of 4.87, which is perfect. The way that I think about it is this color, gray text per se, I always use as 700. And so if I make sure that my 700 has a contrast ratio of around 4.5, that's another thing that I'm going to look to do in every single one of my neutrals palettes. Taking that one step further, I can also fill in the 600 because I know that I'm going to have some kind of disabled text or placeholder text for an input, something like that. Now, the guidelines for placeholder or disabled text are it has to be a contrast ratio of 3.5. So if I run the contrast app here, I can see this is 3.53. Perfect. So right away from my 900, I know that I'm going to be able to derive my 700 and my 600 based off of the necessary contrast ratios that I need for my text. So from that standpoint, we're going to have 100, 600, 700, and 900 done, knocked out. For 800, all I do is find a little middle ground between my 900 and my 700 by tweaking the brightness. So you can see I just bumped it up from 12 to 20, which kind of sits in between this 45 and 12 here. And again, we're kind of eyeballing this stuff. We just want to fill in the gaps quickly using the framework that we have in place. Now, for 100, if I think about the use case for what this 200 would then need to be, I want it to be able to live as a very, very subtle border around my 100 as a way to help it create some separation from white. So if I zoom in here, see how this 200, which I'll actually open up Figma, I've actually set this border to be 200. And I really am looking for this level of contrast. And so what I do to work my way up is I'll set the border to be the next highest number in each one. And I want to be able to just see it. So if I'm looking back, it's not super noticeable, but it's enough to make the edges a little bit more crisp and help them stand out on top of a white backdrop. So that's how I'm going to create these working your way up. And you can see all I'm doing is just updating this brightness value here. And almost every single time, my 1, 2, and 300 are all gonna fit inside of a range of 10. So that is another thing that's super repeatable, works every single time. So from that standpoint, now we have 100, 200, 300. The only things that are really missing are these 400, 500, and 600, which I'm really kind of just gonna fill in the gaps and adjust them as I need to. And there you have it. This is a full color system that is going to account for pretty much every use case that you can throw at it. Last thing remaining is thinking about different interface colors and success states and things like that. And I actually have left that up to you as a part of the application right after this video.